This is Dr. Karen, and you are listening to the De Facto Leaders Podcast on the B Podcast Network, where I share up-to-date, evidence-based practices, my own experiences, and guest interviews designed to help pediatric therapists, educators, and aspiring school leaders design services that support social, emotional, and academic growth and set kids up for success in adulthood. Whether you want to learn effective strategies for your therapy session or classroom, be an influential leader on your team, or find creative ways to use your skills to advance in your career, I've got you covered. Hey everybody, it's Dr. Karen, and welcome to episode 241 of the De Facto Leaders Podcast on the B Podcast Network. Every few years, conversations about education in the U.S. circle back to the same question: why can't we be more like Finland? In this episode, I sit down with Dr. Chrishawn Finister from Your Joy Psychological to unpack this comparison. We dig into the nuanced relationship between educational eligibility and clinical diagnosis, which often overlap but aren't interchangeable. From there, we widen the lens to explore the broader systems-level challenges that shape how students are identified, supported, and served. Some key themes we discuss are orthographic density and literacy, why differences in written language systems matter when comparing reading outcomes across different countries, population homogeneity and education tracks. When we look at instructional outcomes data, the students included in the education system and the numbers matter. And we have to ask the question, are the same individuals counting when we compare results across countries? Teacher pay and professional identity, and what Finland's investment in teacher preparation and salary looks like compared to the U.S., cultural perceptions of medicine versus education, and why recommendations from evaluations are perceived differently depending on the setting, and who is making decisions about services, and housing instability and socioeconomic factors, and thinking about the fact that we're educating students with complex needs in the U.S. who have varying experiences outside of school. With this in mind, has the education system made more progress than what the media is saying? Rather than looking for a one-size-fits-all solution, we highlight why U.S. educators, policymakers, and clinicians need to understand the challenges and opportunities when designing systems of support. If you've ever wondered where the lines between clinical diagnosis and educational eligibility blur, this conversation will give you a grounded perspective. To share a little bit about our guest, Dr. Chrishawn Finister is an independent practicing licensed psychological associate and a licensed specialist in school psychology, possessing over a decade of experience in the role of school psychologist. Recognized as a nationally certified school psychologist, she is committed to utilizing diagnostically sound assessments to identify learning barriers and implementing research-based interventions to amend challenging behaviors effectively. Dr. Finister is an advocate of culturally competent practices and is dedicated to training future practitioners in the field. She received her foundational training in psychological pedagogy and assessments at Texas Women's University, where she completed her master's degree in 2010. While working in a prominent North Texas public school district, she advanced her education by earning a doctoral degree in educational leadership and policy from the University of Texas at Arlington in 2019. Her contributions to the field extend to academia, where she has served as a guest lecturer at the College of Education at Texas Christian University. Definitely check out the show notes and find all the ways you can connect with Dr. Finister. Before we get going, I wanted to remind you to check out the School Leader's Guide to Executive Functioning Support, my 7-day course designed to help school leaders create a vision for their executive functioning implementation plan on their school teams. To learn more about the program, you can go to drkarendudek-brannan.com/school leaders. Now, please enjoy this conversation with Dr. Chrishawn Finister. Today, I am joined by Dr. Chrishawn Finister from Your Joy Psychological. So thank you so much for being here with me today.
Yes, thank you so much for having me.
So I'd love to hear, let's just start off by having you share a little bit about yourself, what your background is, and then what kind of work you're doing now.
Yeah, excellent. I am dual licensed in the state of Texas as both a school psychologist as well as a licensed psychological associate, independently practicing. And essentially, what that means is that I am licensed to conduct psychoeducational evaluations in the school setting to help identify criteria for special education services, and then in the clinical setting to diagnose disorders such as autism, ADHD, learning disability for those who need a clinical diagnosis.
Great. So lots of different directions we can go with that. I think the first place we could start is educational versus clinical. I know that's definitely of interest to a lot of our listeners here because some of them are maybe working in one or both of those settings, but also just navigating how it's different from
Yeah.
clinical versus the schools. So maybe we could start off with how do you explain the difference to people? I mean, even not just parents, but professionals who are trying to navigate the differences.
You're right, because those of us who don't do the evaluations often are very confused by it. So essentially, I just started saying, what does a child need educationally? And so sometimes I give the example of, say, a child was unable to walk medically for whatever reason. Okay. If
Yeah.
that child is able to still navigate the educational environment, they can able to have some mobility around the school, even if it's aided, they could sit and learn and receive the instruction, then that child really doesn't have an educational need. They have a medical condition. And so that's
Hmm.
how I kind of try to explain it to people. And I explain that, hey, there is a medical model and then there's the school-based model. And we're in the school-based model, we're solely looking at what is impacting that child, if anything, and keeping them from learning.
Yeah. That is, yeah, I mean, I know it sounds logical on paper, right?
Yes.
But man, when you get into I can think of some of the other conversations that I've had on here with like I had a speech pathologist who does swallowing and feeding evaluations
Yes.
and that line between what's educational and what's medical, it's I think what gets challenging is when you have a disability that is not physical. Like
Yes.
again, if
Yes. The
someone
unseen
can't walk, if it's an
disability.
orthopedic impairment,
Yes.
that's physical, you can see that. But if you have something like autism, ADHD, dyslexia, developmental language disorder, and you can't see it, it gets a little, I think it gets a little murkier.
Yeah.
What,
So, Dr.
so
I'm
yeah.
so sorry. I was going to say I had some examples for you.
Oh yeah, let's go there. I'd love to hear about that.
So I was just gonna say, absolutely, I was agreeing with you wholeheartedly about the non-seen disabilities, those
Yeah.
invisible. So, for example, especially as a school psychologist, thinking about like mental health, like depression,
Oh
or
yeah.
even sometimes ADHD, because people always say ADD, and I'm like, no, 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 no. ADD is a very dated term. I know that,
Yeah.
and for lay people, in the community, they understand that, but that really is a dated term. So, and I bring that up because ADHD is attention deficit hyperactivity disorder is an inattentive type, hyperactive where you can see it, or it could be a combination of both. And so
Hmm.
sometimes we have those students who I say are not squeaky wheels, meaning that they
Yeah.
could be struggling academically, but you can't physically see it because they're not acting out. And so those may be our children who are withdrawn. They might have some difficulties with focus. So they might have the ADHD inattentive type, or they might even have some depression or anxiety. And because they're so quiet, we cannot see that. And so I think that's when we start talking about making sure that educators and so forth have a good rapport. But before we get to that part, oftentimes I've seen that throughout my career is, for example, the school counselor is often an entryway. And so if there are
Yeah.
concerns, a lot of times people know the school counselor more than they even know like a school psychologist. And so school counselors will then come to me and say, hey, this child has come in with a clinical diagnosis of depression or anxiety. They need SPED. And so I have to say, let's stop. Let's see what the child's educational need is. Let's start looking at that data. And so then that's when we start talking about MTSS, multiple tiered systems of support. And that previous term caveat used to be what we call RTI, responsive intervention. And as you know, education always has different reiterations of terms, but it's essentially the same thing. So when that concern is brought to the committee or brought to like the school counselor, we then need to pull in all the key stakeholders. So those would be like the teacher, sometimes maybe an assistant principal, to really find out, hey, so the parent has delivered this information to us. Let's see if the child has any educational needs. What are the child's grades looking like? Is the child actually physically coming to school consistently? Does this child have friends? Just trying to really look at the child as a whole and to see if there's a need that we aren't meeting in the school setting.
Yeah, absolutely. And I know I used to sit on one of those committees. We call it the problem solving committee. Every district has a different name for it. Hopefully most districts have something in place or some kind of a system for looking at students and problem solving or coming up with ideas before you get to the point that it's a special education evaluation, even though sometimes that is where it ends up and sometimes that is appropriate. But I recall a lot of times looking at some of those outside evaluations, and our team definitely, I think there were many times when we appreciated it because we did not have the bandwidth, the tools, sometimes the expertise, or I mean, even the time to be able to evaluate for some of the things that were being done in these outside evaluations. But sometimes I would say there was definitely some conflict sometimes with some of the recommendations that were made, and it totally depended on the relationship with the parent and how much communication there had been with the provider beforehand. And, because sometimes it's like, the evaluation is kind of slapped down on the table. That's like, you need to do this. And then sometimes it's a nice collaborative relationship where you're working together and it's a nice tool that the team can use. So I'm curious how you've navigated some of those situations being on both sides in your experience.
Well, I will say that is a particular pain point that often I don't get to talk about a lot. But medical doctors and pediatricians, not that they aren't brilliant people, I'm not saying that, but they don't know school systems. And I just think that it is just a part of American culture where we respect doctors. And I don't think there's anything wrong with that. But there really are two different models. And it has been a point of frustration when I've gotten a script like an old school like prescription script for doctors IEP needed. And the parent is like, well, my doctor said. I'm like, but your doctor has no authority here and does not understand school systems. I've even had the pleasure of speaking to doctors where I've had doctors. So for example, when we're looking at a learning disability, we're looking at a pattern of strengths and weaknesses. And unfortunately, in some cases, some children, not that they don't need help, they just don't have a disabling condition. And I have to, and I try to make sure that language is very clear when we're getting consent to do evaluations in the school setting. Yeah. And I say that because if you don't, all parents will hear if a child doesn't qualify is you're not going to help my child. Yeah. Just making sure that is very clear. And so I've had conversations with medical providers who said, well, this child is struggling, they need help. And I've explained to them that, yes, we understand they need help, but they don't have a disabling condition, which meets one of the 14 criteria under the Individual with Disability Education Act. So it's not that the child doesn't need help, they just don't have a disability. And that can be a point of frustration, not only for medical providers, parents, and also educators when they see that a child does have some difficulties, but they're just kind of, I call it in the instructional ravine, where the child is not low enough to have an intellectual disability, but they're not having those strengths or weaknesses to indicate they have a learning disability. And so I just think really trying to explain the nomenclature and explain what we're doing. And it's just about taking the time. And so I've always tried to pride myself one of those practitioners when I've been in those situations. I'm like, hey, do you have 5-10 minutes? Let me explain to you, because it's not that we're not trying to do it, or not that we're like again, just hearing you're not trying to help, you don't want to help my child, that's not by any means the case, but we're ultimately looking for a disability. And so I just try to take the time to explain what a disability is. And then also, too,
Mm-hmm.
Dr. Karen, in the same token, sometimes children, there's a disconnect understanding under the Americans with Disability Act. Under those two
Yeah.
branches, we have special education, and then the other branch, we have 504. So just explaining what the difference is between 504 accommodations and actually needing special education services. And so just even explaining those two, because sometimes a child doesn't need to be serviced under special education. With that medical or clinical evaluation they receive, they're able to get accommodation and support in the school where not only the child is assisted, but also the teachers also get some support. So again, it's all about education, and I try to pride myself on taking the time to explain both.
Yeah, I found that the difference between 504 and IEP is confusing because I've had parents who their child already has an IEP and they're like, "Wait, what's this 504 thing? Can I have one of those too?" And it's like, "Well, you're actually already covered. The IEP
Yep,
actually already has accommodations on it, and a 504 is actually less involved from a standpoint of
absolutely.
accommodations versus accommodations and services. And so that is I think confusing as well. And I think what it can be confusing with getting a diagnosis outside and the different eligibility criteria in schools versus being able to access service in an outside clinical setting, just the idea that you can have a diagnosis and someone in an outside setting can give you a diagnosis and make recommendations, and that a diagnosis can give you information, and it can be something that facilitates and provides support and information for a school team to have the data that they need to show that a student is eligible. But it's not a what's the word? Like I don't want to say a guarantee, but it's a factor. It's not like a
Yeah,
black and white
an
deciding
absolute.
factor.
Yeah, absolutely. And I've also too tried to explain to parents, um, you know, the school day, and sometimes that's hard because I know, and don't get me wrong, education is not always perfect, but I will say sometimes I think parents, I've come across parents who are like, you're hiding something. You're trying to keep
Mm,
a support from my child. When
hmm.
really services and resources in the school setting really are limited. Even the school day is limited. Like there's
Yeah.
only 6 or 7 hours in the school day. So sometimes we've even had to explain to parents, like, okay, so the medical model, when you're going, so for example, I'll say like occupational therapy per se.
Yeah.
If you go to occupational therapists, they may be able to write you a treatment plan that has, maybe hours in the week. Whereas in the school setting, you have to educate the child. That's the main purpose. So the child can't be out of the classroom for hours at a time because then they're
Yeah.
missing the main instruction. And so sometimes just trying to point that out to parents, like, you know, while the even identification, the medical model has, the diagnostic statistical manual is like hundreds of pages
Hmm.
versus
Yeah.
IDEA criteria. There's only 14 disability criteria. So again, we're trying to, what's the word I want to say? We're trying to compact all of the child's needs in a 7-hour day to get them the educational, get them the academics that they need. And so when we explain to parents sometimes like that, they're like, oh, okay. They kind of have a little bit more of understanding, is that ultimately we only have a finite amount of time to educate your child to get them these grade level standards. So there's only so much that we can do. And so kind of explaining the medical model, when you go to them, yes, they're trying to treat whatever that um, diagnosis is, versus in the school setting, we are trying to, whatever we need to get your child to get them educationally equipped. And also, too, I wanted to point about, also, too, I'm talking about nomenclature a lot, because how you speak and identify things is truly important.
Yeah.
I always explain to parents, first, when they come to the school setting, my doctor diagnosed, or even in the clinical setting, they'll come to me and say, the school diagnosed my child. And I say, no, 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 no. Schools do not diagnose. And just again, trying to correct that language to kind of help foster some understanding, is that schools do not diagnose. We identify disability criteria, which again, I just think the terms that you use and how you phrase them are really important in garnering the understanding.
Yeah, that is tricky for the practitioners as well because a clinician, you have the skills to diagnose. If you were literally doing that same evaluation in another setting, you might use different terms to describe
Yes.
what you're doing. So, and with the whole how people look at schools versus medical settings and just culturally how we think about that, I've had situations where somebody with the same credentials as me, or maybe I actually was had more credentials on paper than and more experience than this other person, but I've had parents say, well, this is more this evaluation over here is more valuable because it was done in a medical setting.
Hmm.
In yours, well, it was done at the school, and they see it differently just because the schools are seen differently than a medical setting. And I think when a parent or, other family member or whoever is responsible for, supporting the student, when you have to go and invest your time and sometimes money in an evaluation versus something that
Yes.
is provided by a public school, your perception is different of it.
Correct.
Not that, I mean, you're paying for it with your taxes, but
Right.
people see it differently when they
Oh,
have to,
absolutely.
go outside of the school day and invest in something. It sometimes gives this perception of value, which sometimes, I mean, obviously it is very valuable to go and invest in an outside evaluation or services for your child. But it's, again, that's I think we'll get into that a little bit when we talk about some of your experiences in in other countries.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think people definitely think of them differently, even though a lot of times the difference is just what system you're working in and the language
Yeah.
that you use to describe what you're doing.
And I can say, at least from my training as a school psychologist, we are so you do not diagnose. Like it is like hammered into us. Like you are in the school, you are a school-based practitioner. But for me, in my particular situation, I took some extra steps in my state so that I could diagnose outside of the school setting to get that additional license and credential. So for me, it's like second nature. Like when I'm in the school, who am I doing this for? I've even done some
Hmm.
clinical reports where I have specifically the parents have hired me to do both. So I write a clinical diagnosis and a school-based impact statement. So I think it's definitely about your training. But again, like I keep mentioning, it's about education. I try to
Yeah.
be a practitioner when people come to me. I try to explain to them what I'm doing, why I'm doing it, and who I'm doing it for. And I think that makes a world of difference. Same thing when I'm in the school setting. Before you even, or while we're getting consent, I try to explain that this is not for help. We are ultimately looking for a disabling condition in your child so that if your child doesn't meet disability criteria, the parent is not taking that in as the school is not trying to help their child.
Hmm. Yeah, that's I would have appreciated that so much when I was in the schools, and there were so many people in the community that were just really great partners to work with because it's somebody else who is helping your students. I mean, like you said, there's only so many hours in the day, so it's really great to have that partnership
Yeah.
when when there's that back and forth and it's collaborative. I think what I the way that I like to think about it as well, when you have to factor in how things work in a school versus how they might work in a clinical setting, private practice, is when somebody comes to you for an outside evaluation and maybe you're offering services, it's just, should we offer services, yes or no? And yes,
Yeah.
the parents or the family or whoever is investing time in their day and that they could be doing something else. But really within the school, you always have to factor in not just what are we providing, but what are they missing? Like
Yes.
because you're missing that academic time. So you always have to, on the IEP document, what are the downsides of providing the service? And again, it's seen differently when it's just, should we provide this, yes or no, versus what are the trade-offs of providing this in the schools because we have so many other things that we have to address during the school day.
Right. And I always explain to parents too, like special education is, or, um, well, compulsory education is a civil rights issue. So your
Yeah.
child has a right to a free and appropriate education. And so one of the things we discuss at we say ARD in Texas, in the IEP meeting, is that we are looking at least restrictive environment. And
Hmm.
so, we always, and I know it can be like parents like, oh my gosh, another acronym, another, but it's
Yeah.
really important to educate them so that they understand, like saying, look, while you may think my child needs, 3 hours of speech services, it if we did that in the school setting, we've now violated your child's civil rights. They
Yeah.
are now not receiving that instruction that they can't get back from the gen ed setting. And now we put them in a setting where they are considered no longer mainstreamed. That
Hmm.
becomes a self-contained environment where the
Yeah.
majority of their support is in special education, away from their typically developing peers. So again, really explaining the system to parents and even to my fellow educators who may be more they're very knowledgeable about general education, but special education is a whole nother beast.
Yeah.
Support service is a whole nother beast. We're really trying to explain that if we did what you're asking, this is a violation of your child's rights. And so
Hmm.
just really explaining that.
I love that explanation because people don't think of it that way. A lot of times they think, well, you're not providing this
Yeah.
service, you're taking something away, but actually, in a way, it's advocating for the student.
Yes. Yes.
Or even with accommodations. I mean, we could go on all day about how providing accommodations that students don't need is not in their best interest because that's an opportunity to learn a skill.
Or even sometimes think about, again, we talk about those invisible disabilities, or
Yeah.
sometimes those accommodations can be we have too many adults, especially at a certain age, hovering over a student. That
Yeah.
feels even more like, okay, this is too much. And now I'm too visible to my peers, saying that I need help. And so, again,
Hmm.
best laid plans, the best intentions, but you have to be careful that you don't start to infringe upon other rights or other concerns in that child's educational process.
Are you working with students who experience anxiety and overwhelm with new challenges, who refuse or avoid difficult tasks, or require constant prompting? Or maybe they have difficulty filtering distractions, they're missing assignments, they tend to run late, and they struggle to transfer skills from one setting to another, or don't appear to learn from past mistakes. These behaviors are showing up more and more frequently in classrooms across schools and not just in special education. The truth is, we're seeing a surge of students in both general and special education who desperately need these foundational skills. With so many competing priorities and options for educators, it seems impossible for school leaders to know where to focus their attention. What if there was a way to transform multiple challenges with one powerful approach without overwhelming your already maxed out team? Turns out there is. Beneath many of these challenges often lies a powerful root cause: executive functioning. Executive functioning skills are the critical mental processes that work behind the scenes as your internal coach, acting like your brain's CEO. These powerful cognitive abilities help you manage frustrations, make decisions, follow through on plans, envision the future, and adapt when things don't go as expected. And let's be honest, teachers are drowning between curriculum requirements, testing pressures, behavior management, and the mountain of paperwork. They're stretched thinner than ever. The last thing they need is another standalone program to implement. That's why I've created the School Leader's Guide to Executive Functioning Support, a 7-day course to launching your team's executive functioning implementation plan. When you join, each day you'll get an email with a summary walking you through a foundational concept that will help you design an implementation plan for your team. We'll uncover executive functioning challenges, and I'll show you how to identify the telltale signs. We'll organize skills for intervention, and we'll wrap up with essential takeaways and a prompt to help you get started with your 90-day action plan, plus a curated list of resources to provide support and help you implement what you've learned. To learn more about the School Leader's Guide to Executive Functioning Support, go to drkarendudekbrannan.com/school leaders. Yeah, and I think what is important in that conversation about the least restrictive environment is that people think of it as a place, like you're in the special ed room or you're not in the special ed room. But accommodations and supports can be part of that least restrictive. It's not, even if you're in the general education classroom, if you have a teaching assistant hovering over you or whoever, and you're not able to be independent or you're not allowed to develop that independence, that's not least restrictive either.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, I could tell you, I've had so many situations like that where parents, who had children who were differently abled, and so they wanted them mainstreamed and gen ed
Hmm.
majority of their day, which is excellent. Okay, let's see what we can do. But then they would always want to have a one-on-one aid, and we'd be like, well, no, if we did that, then that child is that's the most restrictive that you can have because that's not what
Yeah.
a typically developing peer would get. So really trying to find that balance and an understanding where yes, we want to support children, but we also don't want to infringe upon their rights at the same time.
Hmm. Yeah. That's
Yeah,
again, I just taking it back to what are their rights and what is the purpose of school? And
absolutely.
again, it's to develop the academic skills that are going to be relevant for your life. Which, yeah, I mean that whether what's relevant to your life beyond school is probably a whole separate podcast. But obviously, when we're thinking about math and literacy, I mean, those are the content areas obviously being
Yeah.
very important as well, and electives and vocational education and all of that. But obviously, I think about reading a lot, reading and math, the two
Yes.
that are. I know reading's getting a lot of attention right now, and I'm seeing math start to get more attention, which makes me happy. But
And that's also too, I think, we talked about like perceptions. And so I'm
mhm,
like a big history buff. That's kind of what I wrote my dissertation on, like history of special ed law. But, you know, just also to the mindset, special ed is about 50 years old in this country now. It
mm,
initiated in 1975. And I say that because what once was a place, special education is no longer a destination. And I know that whether history or previous experience, sometimes parents or educators will bring that. And for those of us who are on the front line of psychoeducational evaluations and who are advocates for special ed, really explaining that, modern day specialized support services are not a place. They are exactly that, services. Now, sometimes some
mhm,
children, it may involve a placement, but just kind of keeping in mind that we're looking at services and support. So,
mhm. Yeah, that's very important.
yes.
So I would love to hear about, so I know you've had some experiences working in other countries. And
Mhm.
as we're talking about these different systems and how things work in the US, it's definitely relevant to think about how things work in other countries. So I know you've had a couple different experiences, and I'd love to just open it up and let you talk a little bit about where you were and what you learned.
Okay. And Dr. Karen, that's also a good segue because I was talking about history. And so I
Yeah,
do think history is important to think about, well, where do we start off and how do we end up here?
yeah.
So after undergrad, I graduated undergrad in 2004. I had the opportunity to go to Japan and teach English for a year. And that was amazing, being immersed in their culture and how they educated their children. And so one thing that I learned in Japan was that, it seemed like their students were tracked. So from I think it was like very much culturally like you were supposed to just play until the age of 6. And then after 6, you were kind of like, okay, which track were you going to be going on? Like, were you going to
Mm,
be to the university track? Are you going to be vocational track? And so that was culturally interesting, especially thinking about how, we were educated or our ideas of education here in America.
hmm.
And so, as one who works on the bell curve, in American education, we try to educate that entire bell curve, which
Yeah.
I think sometimes when you hear politicians or people spewing stuff about education, don't really think about that. So, you think about the bell curve, you think about the majority of the population being average, so typically developing. And then you have those who are above average, who are just extreme intelligence. And then you have those who are extremely below average. So even here, like in the state of Texas, we have what we call the state STAR exam. Every couple of years, they call it something different, but that is like the state metric for children that they have to pass. And I say that because we have children who are included in how we're functioning or how text education is being graded, who unfortunately have like do not resuscitate. So these children are so medically fragile that their STAR exam is the teacher counting their eyelash blinks.
Mm-hmm.
So just think about that. You're
Yeah.
educating that whole population. We've got children who are just trying to just basically take breaths, just so medically fragile. And then we have those who are going to go on to be our just above average, our neurophysicists who, but we monitor and put all those children in the same pool. And I say that because, like, by experience in Japan, teaching in English, I could tell that wasn't necessarily the case. Where
Yeah.
like these were the children that have kind of been identified to be like our top academics, and these children, well, yeah, we're going to support them, but we're not pushing them the same way as we're pushing these particular pool of children. And I say that because we have some, again, standardized tests where we're standardized testing the whole bell curve, which doesn't make sense if you're looking at the mathematics of the bell curve. I just told
Mm-hmm.
you so much of the population is going to be typical and so much of the population is not. So then why do we have these same kind of metrics for everybody? And then fast forward to much later on in adulthood. In 2019, I had the opportunity to go and serve as a school psychologist in Qatar in the Middle East. And that was an amazing experience. I was there for 8 months. And essentially, I was hired because, as I had mentioned earlier, special education law had been established in our country in 1975.
Mm-hmm.
So prior to that, in America, there were millions of children who were differently able or severely disabled who were just at the home and not educated. So that change in Qatar had started to happen. I think I got there in 2019. I think they were saying like the mid 90s to then.
Oh,
So
wow.
about 10, 15
Okay.
years where they had started to have the movement too and saying, hey, we also have differently able individuals in our population. How can we start to educate them too? So a lot of
Mm-hmm.
us from the West or other countries around the world were there to kind of teach about our specialized support services. So that's why I think that is amazing if you think about it. Even in my lifetime, what we kind of, in a way, while not perfect, take for granted things that happen in our civil rights movements and how we
Yeah.
educate children, other countries were just starting to adopt, in the late 20th century. I thought that
Yeah.
was amazing. And then I also too, so I actually lived in those two places and kind of worked in those environments. But I also did, while I was working on my PhD, have a cool experience where I got to go to Finland and Sweden to learn about the best education system in the world. And so this was
Uh-huh.
like super curious to me because
Yeah.
up to that point I had worked as a school psych. I had already been licensed as a school psych, but I was working on my doctorate. I had worked in a large city in the public school setting. And so I was really curious, like, what are the Finnish doing to make their
Yeah.
education
That's
system
the
so
$1 million question, isn't
amazing?
it?
And then it became very quickly apparent to me, apples and oranges. There is
Yeah.
like I couldn't imagine how we could replicate what they're doing in Finland here in the States. So one thought is this. So just the sheer size. So at the time that I went, I think it was around 2018, 2017. I think
Okay.
Finnish society they were saying has about 6 million people in their whole country. In America, there's about 6 million students in special education. So
Mm-hmm.
that right there is
Yeah.
crazy, just the amount. Your whole country is what one little subpopulation is in our country.
Mm-hmm.
And then I was asking questions because as a school psychologist, we talk about mental health. How do we
Yeah.
remove barriers in education? And so when we would sit in these seminars, and I would ask, so tell me, how do you handle your children, your population who are homeless? And they would be like, homeless? Homeless? What do you mean? These are problems that they don't even have. Like they couldn't even comprehend the idea of like homelessness or children whose home situation is not stable. So
Mm-hmm.
that was like to me mind blowing because these are things that I dealt with all the time in a large urban
Yeah.
population. Or even how when we first started talking, Dr. Karen, we're talking about MTSS or
Yeah.
RTI, what you call them problem solving meetings, or even the fact that we talked about school-based criteria and diagnoses in the medical model. In Finland, they had like one system where everything was right there. So there was no, well, the doctor said or the school said. It seemed like children had like one file of their needs to just get things done. And I thought that was amazing. Because, like, for example, here in the state of Texas, if I can identify that, yep, I do believe that attention and focus is keeping a child from learning. But ultimately, even though I have the measures to identify it, a medical doctor has to sign off to say that a child meets the criteria. So without
Hmm.
that medical diagnosis, then we cannot service that child in the school setting. And sometimes that can be a, a point of frustration if the parent doesn't have
Yeah.
access or their insurance. So I did think that was super cool that it seemed in Finland that sort of barrier didn't exist because everything was under
Yeah.
one system. And so I was just amazed by that. And they also seem to have like one mindset. And I thought about homogeneity, like in Japan, as well as
Hmm.
in Finland. And I think about American culture. There's so many different microcultures here for
Yeah.
education, just educational thought processes. Even for example, I'm originally from Buffalo, New York, and New York City is 8 hours away. I know nothing about New York City. People always, but I say that
Hmm.
because culturally, schools in Buffalo are totally different from New York City. And that's just
Hmm.
8 hours. But we're the same country. We haven't even talked about, I live all the way down near the Gulf of Mexico, like in Texas. I'm sure schools when I'm working in the Dallas Fort Worth Metroplex are totally different from those that are in rural Texas. And so there's so many different microcultures in American education culture where it's hard to compare these homogeneous cultures that think the same, move the same. Majority of their students are the same when you just have so much diversity here in America.
Yeah. I can even think like Southern Illinois versus Chicago. Chicago's like its own entity in Illinois. It's
And
not
we've only talked about 3 states. We haven't talked about the other.
I
We haven't talked
know, and
about
I
the
know,
other
and
47.
yeah, and I mean, I work at the state level now, and we look at okay, what models are being used in other states because it's definitely useful to say what's working well here. Like this state, this school is performing well. Why are they performing well, and what can we take and replicate and implement in our system or implement in our district, state, whatever it is. But there's always this, and again, I can think of some things that I'm working on right now where we're taking things that have worked well in other states, because we do have data that the models work well for implementation, but we still have to adapt it to Illinois statutory requirements and the Illinois system. And maybe that does mean the system needs to change, but also there's a reason that a system is how it is. A lot of times it is because of those cultural factors, like you're saying. So I think it's looking at other countries. It's a starting point, not an ending point. It's like what can we take? Because I'm sure that there are things that are being done in Finland that we could implement over here
Yeah.
in the United States that would be useful once we figure out how to apply them. But yeah, it drives me crazy when people are like, we should be more like Finland. And I'm like, but we're not like Finland.
Yeah.
Like,
I mean, so many things, or even, especially like during politics, you hear people spout, oh, we got to fix the education system. Like we're this level in mathematics in the world. But I'm like, wait, let's look at those statistics. If you think about it, a lot of those like studies will actually be, like I mentioned, we're looking at the entire bell curve
mhm.
where other countries are just like, nope, we're only looking at our top 10% people,
Yeah,
our top
yeah,
10%. And then, but in America, like I said, the whole bell curve. So we got those children who, again, who are just medically fragile and maybe cognitively impaired. And those children who are going to, like I said, go on to be who have extreme cognitive abilities, and we're lumping them all in the same pile and trying to compare. You can't do that. But if you
yeah.
take the top 10% of academic achievers and compare them with other top 10%, then you're looking at apples and apples. When we look at American culture, we try to educate everybody. And even the fact that, I know, which I love Qatar, was an amazing place. The Qatari people had started to again identify that neurodiversity and try to educate their entire population the way we have been doing in our country since
Hmm.
1975. But we, like I said, educate everybody. So think about all those different needs that are there, the
Yeah.
outward disabilities, those that are quiet, all of those children we try to give a quality education to in this country. And I don't think people understand the sheer magnitude of that and what that truly takes to try to give every child what they need. So
Hmm.
again, while it's not perfect, I'm not saying we don't have room for growth. I will give us a little hand clap and commend American culture for attempting to try to educate the entire population where some other countries may not be quite there yet.
Yeah. I love that. I think we're making progress. It
Yes.
progress is it's there's a couple people that I've been reading lately. There's Mark Manson and Steven Pinker. Both of
Mhm.
them talk about progress in very different ways, but I think Steven Pinker's take is that if you actually look at the numbers and the data, we have made progress. It's just there are still lots of things to work on. And I think what Mark Manson says is we've made progress. So what the status quo has changed, and his take was more we've just found pettier things to complain about, but which maybe that's true, but you just get used to what again, you get used to what you're used to, and then the things that are problems they weren't problems before.
Yes.
Just this past week, I was complaining about something that I had to deal with at work. Like my computer wasn't working and I had to drive across town to get tech support and it was really annoying. And then I thought to myself, I could be a caseworker out in the field responsible for making the decision whether or not to,
Mm-hmm.
that deciding if the state should take protective custody of a child.
Mm.
Like, I can deal, this problem is annoying and it
Yeah.
seems annoying because it was the most annoying thing I've had to deal with today, but other people, like, it's all relative. It's just a comparison thing.
And I was going to say too, Dr. Karen, and this is probably another podcast, but
Yeah.
generations. And I see that like in my clinical setting where, like I feel like Gen Zers now, they're going into early adulthood. So they have insurance, they're coming to get evals. Millennials are bringing their children like, I was raised by a boomer. I probably should have had an evaluation, but my parents didn't necessarily believe in that. Or even I have some baby boomers who are like, hey, I've been dealing with some stuff that probably for years I was kind of ignored. And now I think I should get evaluated. So I think not today, but definitely looking at generations and how generations respond to kind of in response to what
Mhm.
you were saying about how like the we've gotten maybe pettier or in some ways wiser about certain
Yeah.
things or more sensitive to certain things that maybe previous generations weren't, or it was there but they didn't know how to identify or address it. So I agree.
Yeah. And maybe saying it's pettier is a cynical way to explain it. I think you get used to what you get used to, and
Yes.
it's when you look back and think, wow, it doesn't mean that your challenges that you're facing just because they're less intense, it doesn't mean that they're not valid and it's not reasonable to be frustrated by things. It's just different. And I think
Yes.
sometimes it does help to know, or at least helps me sleep at night to know that it is getting better. It's just that you have to kind of zoom out and look at it differently to know or to notice those types of things.
Absolutely, absolutely. Especially when you think about education being such an intimate thing. When you think
Hmm.
about working with a child and impacting a child's life, and then a community system can be an intimate thing, and then that city, it's just a huge undertaking. So I just try to be gentle with my educators because they take on a lot, and I hope that the community at large sees that and tries to support their local community educators.
Yeah, definitely. I know it's easy to what's the word I'm looking for? Just
Condemn,
be
vilify,
critical of
critical.
education, I
Yes,
think.
yeah.
I don't know, and when we were back on the conversation about other countries and things like that, I follow Tim Shanahan. Do you follow
Hmm.
him at all?
I don't.
Um okay, so definitely recommend. looking into his take on the Finland conversation and
Okay.
how we're handling literacy, which obviously, again, with literacy, I think we have made a lot of progress. There's still a lot of progress to be made, but what he goes into is not just the population and the culture comparing different countries, but linguistic complexity and orthographic density, which when we're talking about how is the US handling reading instruction versus how are other countries doing it, well, we have to think about the English language and what it takes to learn English and when kids, like what kind of instruction is required and why is it easier to learn to read in other languages and how quickly kids pick it up. So that is a different take. I've heard again, the conversations around the size of the population, which I think are valid reasons to say, hey, we can't just directly replicate what Finland is doing. But the orthographic density conversation is also an interesting one that doesn't get brought up as much. Maybe in the reading and literacy circles, but not in the broader ed leadership spaces as much as it probably should be. So definitely recommend checking out his blog if you
Shanahan.
want more conversations about just comparison between different countries.
And I also want to say, I'm gonna do a little plug for my teachers here.
Yeah.
They pay their teachers super well. It is like,
Oh.
they are, again, from when I was there, they were explaining that it's hard to get into a college of education in Finland. Like that is
Hmm.
a highly sought after because their teachers are they're paid well, they're highly respected in their culture. And so again, that might be another podcast, but I mean, all these factors go into it. So, I wonder, I think about the stressors that some of our educators have trying to, get children past standardized tests or maybe not making a healthy enough salary, even though they are these are professionals. I just
Yeah.
like in I've had conversations that they're like, well, I'm like, well, yes, while yes, you may be a lawyer, and yes, that is a professional degree, educators are also too professional. Like there's people studying reading, studying math, studying pedagogy. How do you actually, present these topics so that children or your students, can master them? So that's also to another conversation I have too, just culturally, the
Hmm.
respect that those teachers are given. And, just wonder if we had a culture shift like that where we elevated that profession, what would education look like?
Yeah. That is, I would say, if you could pick something that we borrow from Finland, that would be my pick personally. And it's hard when you have multiple issues.
Mm-hmm.
It's never just one thing, but sometimes it's hard to tell. Like, what if we just pulled one lever and what would happen? But that's
One
a
at a
big
time.
lever.
Yeah. Yeah. But like I say, put your money where your mouth is. If you want that,
Yeah.
sometimes, you do, and I think you touched on it earlier, how you said, well, yes, public funding and people may, but funding is needed. It just is what it is, sometimes
Yeah, exactly.
you have to have those funds, put those funds in the right places. So
Hmm. It would be interesting if, because again, when it's a huge culture shift in an entire country, that's a big change. And it's like, what would it take to do that? And I think it's sometimes it almost has to start with, one state doing it or one district doing it or something. I don't know. I'm not sure what the answer is to that.
no, but you're right. I mean, it would have to be. I just again, I keep thinking about the sheer. Sometimes I forget about the sheer size of our country. Like, when I
Yeah.
was living in Japan, and they'd be like, "Oh, our country's so tiny." I'm like, "Huh?" And I think about it. I'm like, "Wow!" Like, you're right.
Yeah.
Like, I don't think about the sheer size of our country or how like driving across 3 or 4 states. It's like 3 or 4 countries. In Europe. So
I know.
I was like, our country
Yeah.
is massive and so many different, like you said, even just in the state, all the different cultures in the state. So,
Hmm. Yeah, I think about that all the time, especially when I go to another country and it's like, oh, just, drive an hour and you cross a border.
You're like, wait, huh? No, not
Yeah.
well. If you're on a border town, you can. But yeah, I get you. It's just a massive undertaking. And
Hmm.
I once had a professor tell us, well, we know what's wrong with education. It's just who's going to actually do it. And I thought that was interesting. I'm just like, you're right. In a lot of ways, we
Hmm.
do, but it's going to take resources, it's going to take time, it's going to take mind shifts, all the things. So,
I don't know that we do know, or I don't know that there's an agreement. I mean, I know what I think the problems
right,
are. I
the
don't know that
agreement.
people agree.
That's true. No, that's true. That is
Yeah.
absolutely true. You're right. And again, like I was saying, all these micro cultures that we have, you're
Yeah.
absolutely right. And honestly, the needs are different. Like we said,
Yeah.
the needs in different places, the needs that, we may have in rural Kansas may be different from LA. So absolutely.
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah. Well, so many different things to talk about. I don't know if we solved all of the problems in this conversation, but it gave some people some things to think about. So, where can people go to connect with you, learn more about your work, and
Yeah,
yeah,
absolutely.
share all the places that people
Yes.
can go to
So
learn
in
about you.
Yes, if you are in Texas, I'm here and would love to do a clinical diagnosis if needed. You can find me at www.yourjoypsych.com. You can also find me on Instagram at yourjoypsych. And also, too, if you are in a giving mood, I also have a nonprofit which provides free evaluations for those who have no insurance or are underinsured at the Texas Psychological Hive. So that's www.thetexaspsychive.org. And you can also find me on Instagram at the Texas Psych Hive. And so we are seeking donations for those who, again, need those clinical evaluations. They need those identifications to get support in the community for like ABA therapy or medication as they transition from high school to college to get those accommodations, and their IEPs no longer will support them because, again, you're leaving the K through 12 system and you're going into a different educational model. And so we are always seeking funds to get support for that. So, yes, I am out there. So please check me out.
Thank you so much for being here. I can't believe we didn't even talk about your nonprofit that much.
Oh, yeah. I know we start talking about education. Education is like a zoom. But yes,
Yeah.
but no. But I appreciate you, Dr. Karen, for having me. I'm glad just to be able to talk and have this discussion.
Yeah.
And I hope those who, if they have additional conversations or questions for me, they reach out to me on my website.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for being here.
No problem. Thank you for having me.
Thank you so much for listening. Be sure to check the show notes for all the places you can go to connect with our amazing guest. And also be sure to check the show notes for more information about the School Leader's Guide to Executive Functioning Support, a 7-day course that shows school leaders how to get started with their executive functioning implementation plan. To learn more about the program, you can go to drkarendudek-brannan.com/school leaders. I created the School Leaders Guide to Executive Functioning Support because educators have to be everything to everyone in current times. There always seems to be a new initiative, and it can be really difficult for teams to implement yet another standalone program. But the great news about executive functioning support is that it doesn't require complicated materials. It can be seamlessly layered onto existing practices and amplify the effort that you put into content area curriculum. And most importantly, executive functioning support can help you to differentiate instruction for those students who need support in special education as well as general education. It can be a really powerful universal design initiative that ensures you're meeting students where they're at. To learn more about the program, you can go to drkarendudek-brannan.com/school leaders. Thank you so much for listening. Be sure to leave me a rating or review wherever you listen to your podcasts and share this episode with anyone you think would benefit from the information. Thanks again, and I'll see you next time.